Before we start the episode, I want to talk about a new book that I have coming out. It's called What Belongs to Caesar. It's a collection of essays that deal with the relationship of the kingdom of God to the state, or government, and it falls within a tradition that some call Christian anarchism. What is Christian anarchism? Well, I'm hoping to give some background on that in the series of interviews that you're watching right now. Some of the people I'm talking to are Christians who want to strongly distinguish the kingdom of God from the state. Others are anarcho-capitalists who want to minimize the violence that humans do to each other through government by doing away with the state, but not necessarily Christians. And others are a little bit of both. So I strongly encourage you to check out the works of these thinkers and also get a hold of my book, What Belongs to Caesar, which will be out in March of 2022. Thank you and enjoy the show. Greetings, you are listening to and or watching Cantus Firmus, where my guest today is Kristopher Borer. Kristopher Borer, you are the author of a new book, The Ethics of Anarcho-Capitalism. And before we get into what anarcho-capitalism is, can you tell me a little bit about your personal background?
Sure. So I grew up in New Jersey, then I lived in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York for a while, but now I'm based in Miami. I work as a mid-level tech executive at a Fortune 50 company. My background's mainly in robotics and artificial intelligence, but lately I've been doing a lot of web application development. So that's a little bit about me.
Gotcha. So you're kind of like a lower profile Elon Musk.
Much lower profile.
All right, awesome. Well, okay, so to get into your book a little bit, I was kind of talking about this before we started recording. The book sounds very dry, and I bought the book because I don't mind dry books if it's on a subject that I'm interested in. It sounded very academic, The Ethics of Anarcho-Capitalism. So there's 3 words already in there that are going to throw people off. Mm-hmm. But what surprised me was how readable the book was. Actually, I didn't even read it visually. I listened to it on Audible, and I was able to really follow it and enjoy it and connect with it. And I think I heard you say this in another interview, that sometimes when you're reading economic or philosophical works, people will use these kind of interesting examples to try to get their dry academic points home. And this book is pretty much all one big example. And so it's all of the kind of fun part of philosophy and economics, but not the kind of the painful stuff. So ethics, of course, has to do with right and wrong behavior. And what is anarcho-capitalism?
I like to think of anarcho-capitalism as the purest form of libertarianism. Libertarians believe that you should follow the non-aggression principle. It's basically a rule that says don't cause conflict. So that means no theft, no murder, and so on. In other words, live peacefully. You can do things that are bad, like eating junk food, but you shouldn't engage in activities that are evil, like slavery. And under anarcho-capitalism, everyone's expected to follow the non-aggression principle, no exceptions. And most social systems have something similar, a rule like this for regular people, but they give an exception to the rulers. So if you have a king or a government, they don't have to follow the non-aggression principle. They get to steal via taxation or enslave people if they want soldiers to fight in their wars and so on. So even some libertarians think that government should have an exception to the non-aggression principle. They think it's impossible to have private police or private courts. And so they say, well, we have to have, the government has to have a monopoly on these kinds of services. Well, the only way to have a monopoly is to violate the non-aggression principle and use force. So government gets to do things that are evil because it's a necessary evil. Then they try to come up with mechanisms that will ensure that the government will only do evil things when it's absolutely necessary. Constitution, Bill of Rights, etc. And your listeners can decide for themselves whether they think government tends to constrain itself or expand its power over time. But contrary to this, anarcho-capitalists think that society can function without giving anyone an exception to the non-aggression principle. Not only that, they think it'll work much better. Competition in television manufacturing leads to better and cheaper televisions every year. And the same thing would apply to private police and courts. If you have competing police companies, the ones that provide the best protection would, at the cheapest price will get the most customers, and the ones that shoot your dog will go out of business. So There's another, that's basically the ethical side of it. There's another side that I don't touch much on in the book, and that's the cultural side. There's a culture around that many ANCAPs have around promoting increasing wealth and technology. They want the world to be peaceful, but they also want everyone to be healthy and wealthy. So they promote things like savings and cooperation that leads to the kind of life that many people like to live. So from an ethical perspective, anarcho-capitalism is just pure libertarianism. From a cultural perspective, I'd say it's like a freedom maximizing philosophy.
So one thing that occurs to me, and it's something that your book addressed that a lot of ANCAPs that I've read haven't really talked about, is ANCAP meaning anarcho-capitalist. So some people may have seen kind of the memes with the charts where you have like the 4 different quadrants. And on the bottom right, you have anarcho-capitalism. The bottom left, you have anarcho-communism. And so in anarcho-communism, I think the idea is that if you get rid of the state, everything will ultimately be held in common, because you're getting rid of this kind of coercive power. And when that happens, everybody will share everything. Anarcho-capitalists go, well, no, not really, because you can't. People are going to have property unless you force them not to. But one thing that you talk about in the book that I thought was kind of interesting, because as I said, a lot of ANCAPs don't really talk about it, is you do deal with this question of the commons a little bit, that there are certain things that could be held in common. I mean, communists say everything is held in common. Anarcho-capitalists tend to almost talk like nothing. There could be no kind of public space. But you discuss that idea a little bit. And maybe before I ask you how, it would be better to go into what I talked about earlier, how this book is one big example. And so could you maybe explain just a little bit of what that example is? Where do we start in the book, and what's the basic premise that's being worked through?
Oh, sure. So I guess the general storyline of the book is that you are stranded on a desert island, and you've got to kind of figure things out on your own. And over time, a few other characters show up. And when you have multiple people living together, sometimes things don't go perfectly, and you've got to find a way to resolve conflicts. And resolving conflicts is what ethics is all about. So it kind of sets the stage for using different rules of libertarianism to resolve those conflicts.
And so, and it is a second person. So you're basically put right into the action, because that you language is used. And so someone else shows up in the island, right, who is kind of amenable and friendly. And then there's a third person who shows up who's not so willing to go along and work peacefully.
Yeah.
So on this kind of deserted island situation, people have their own private property, they have their own huts, their coconuts, so on and so forth. So how is it that you address the idea of common property, and is there any usefulness there when you kind of expand this out to a larger scenario outside of a deserted island, maybe into a country or a municipality, something like that?
Yeah, I think an old way of thinking about libertarianism and the private property system is around stuff. So you've got an apple or something, and you own that thing. But as time has progressed, people have come to a more nuanced stance around property and private ownership, where you don't really own things, you own the use of things. So two people might jointly own a car, and one uses it to commute during the day and one uses it to commute at night, or something like that. Or two people might buy a house jointly and own different pieces of it, or things like that. So you can share things, different parts of physical things. You can also share them temporally. And when you think about the commons, a common example is roads. Everyone says, if you don't have government, who's going to control the roads and share the roads, make sure everyone can use roads and get places? But the libertarian ethical system has a pretty straightforward solution to this, and that is, if you start using a pathway or a road, you start to, in a sense, own the right to use it in the way that you've been using it, as long as you're not causing conflict with other people. So if you go for a walk and then your neighbor goes for a walk and everything's peaceful, then you're both entitled to go for walks just like you have been. It's only when, maybe hundreds of people are trying to go for walks and it gets too crowded that you need to resolve those conflicts in different ways. But the private property system has mechanisms for that. And ultimately that leads not to the idea that you should have some government that owns all the roads, but the roads can be owned privately by the people that were using them when they were not so busy, and they can figure out how to, distribute those rights either by selling them or giving them away or just sharing however they want.
Yeah, it was just so funny to me that I'd never really heard Eddie and ANCAP say, just share it. Anyway, we were out the word capitalism, and it has been, I think, getting a pretty bad rap, especially if you're on social media or watch MSNBC. So what to you is the utility of capitalism? Is it a good economic system? Do you think it's exploitative? When people blame it for this kind of rising inflation and greed. People talk about late capitalism. Do you think of capitalism as a good thing, or this sort of dying thing that's going to lead to something else?
Oh yeah, that's a lot to untangle. So what's the utility? Is it a good economic system? Is it exploitive? I'll try to touch on those. So personally, I think the biggest benefit of capitalism is that it makes everyone wealthier. Most places around the world, people are much wealthier than their parents were and their grandparents were. That's not because they're smarter or harder working than their parents or grandparents. I think in many cases the opposite is true. It's just because capitalism has allowed us to accumulate machines and resources that let us be more productive. So we accumulate wealth faster and faster with less work. So people used to have to work 7 days a week just to feed their families. Now companies are talking about a 4-day work week. That's only possible because of capitalism. And the more capitalist a society is, the faster it gains wealth. So if a society moves towards socialism or communism, it can become poor very quickly. If it goes too far towards collectivism, things can kind of go from sad to horrific. So is it a good economic system? I think so, but it depends on your personal moral system. Some people prefer equity over equality. And capitalism makes everyone richer, but it makes a few people super, super rich. And that makes some people jealous and angry. So to those people, capitalism might not be such a great economic system. There's another group of people who would probably consider capitalism to be bad, namely the ruling class, so those in charge of governments around the world. They probably want a little bit of capitalism so that they can leech taxes from productive people, but unbridled capitalism would, by definition, put them out of a job. So for everyone else, I think capitalism is great. We're all working together. Every year we get new music and food and such, but it's not necessarily for everybody. And then you said, is it exploitative? Is it causing inflation? I think in general, capitalism doesn't have exploitation at all. The theory is all interactions are voluntary. So you can't really exploit people under capitalism. You can't be forced to sell your home like governments do with eminent domain. You can't be forced to work like they do with jury duty. Exploiting people violates the non-aggression principle. So only entities that can really exploit others are governments or maybe corporations colluding with governments, things like that. Purely capitalist system would not have any governments to exploit people. And inflation, yeah. You mentioned inflation. That really only exists because of government monopolies on money production. If people were allowed to use whatever money they wanted, then inflationary monies would probably be pushed out of the market as people move their wealth to stable or even deflationary money.
Well, and you kind of mentioned how, through capitalism, we have all these technological advances that we didn't have previously. Not nearly, at least, how do I say this? We weren't moving at nearly the pace that we started moving until sort of capitalism began to take hold.
Yeah.
And also things getting cheaper. And I can sort of hear the, kind of left-leaning person in my ear saying, well, that doesn't apply to things like housing, education, and medical care. And doesn't that just prove the benefits of capitalism? Okay, computers and TVs are getting cheaper, but what about the things that we need to live?
Well, the most basic thing we need to live is food, and food is certainly more abundant than it's ever been. Well, at least in capitalist countries, right? There's some countries that go the other way, and food can be kind of scarce, and it's sad and scary for those countries. But there are certainly distortions in the market that happen that make it seem like capitalism is bad. But most societies are kind of a mix of capitalism and a government system. And when government gets involved, they can do things that really mess up the way the market should be functioning. So I think many people have heard of the housing crisis that happened a decade ago. That's not because capitalism was producing too many houses. It's because the government stepped in and said, home loans are going to be cheaper than they should be. So everyone goes out and buys homes. There's a big boom, a bubble is created, and it pops, and bad things happen. So I have not heard of any examples of capitalism really making people poorer or making things less abundant. But maybe there are. I just haven't heard of them.
That's a fair answer, I think. Yeah, because the examples you gave of things getting cheaper and advancing more quickly are those areas where government tends to be less involved in regulating them. Yeah. I was kind of curious about how the book came together, in the sense of, was it always kind of supposed to be this thing that was kind of easy to follow and read, or did you set out to write something that was more like a tome? How did that start?
I guess when I originally started writing about ethics, I was reading a lot of academic papers and thick academic books like we were talking about before, and so I tried to emulate that. So I wrote a few papers, I published them in journals, and no one really cared, right? Even regular people don't like to read academic papers, and even academics don't really like to read them either. So you write something, nobody reads it, and then what happens? Not much. So when I started thinking about writing a book, I thought, well, if I really want to have an impact and spread the ideas, then it's got to be easily digestible. And so I tried to think, what's a good way for the average person, or maybe the average person who's interested in philosophy, to consume these ideas. And so kind of naturally landed on narrative nonfiction. And like you said earlier, the examples are kind of usually the most compelling thing in economics and ethics. So I just tried to make the book chock full of those.
And yeah, and I mean, which is not to say that there aren't the kind of complex ideas that are throughout the book. Like you do talk about the non-aggression principle, which is the principle, the idea that it's always wrong to initiate aggression against someone else, and praxeology, which is this idea that comes from Ludwig von Mises, who's an economist. And so how do you make praxeology seem accessible to a mainstream audience?
Great question. I think praxeology is somewhat relatable in a sense. It's the study of purposeful behavior, and purposeful behavior is something that everyone can understand if you explain it in a certain way. You eat an apple. You eat an apple because you're hungry. You sit down when you're tired, and so people can understand. You've got these things you want to do, and you take action because of your desires, and you can give very simple examples. And that's not always the case. In many books that use praxeology, the authors go very deep, and they go into complex and kind of wonderful ideas about human behavior, and it's not easy to grasp. So I guess just like you start kids with simple mathematics, I only touched on the most basic uses of praxeology. And fortunately, you only need a little bit of it to get started in ethics. So it's just enough. But if some of your listeners are very interested in praxeology, there are books that go into much more advanced ideas, both in ethics and economics. Mises wrote a great book called Human Action. Hans Hermann Hoppe's got a great book called Economics and Ethics of Private Property. They're more like textbooks, though, so I don't want people to go in expecting fun adventure stories. It's more like the dry academic textbook.
Yeah, what I would actually probably encourage people to do is start with something like your book, and if they're interested at that point, then to move forward, because I think you really do a great job of getting these ideas started. And I mentioned I listened to the audiobook, and I loved the audiobook a lot. So as I recall, I mean, a lot of libertarians would sort of ground their ethical system, or the ethical part of their system at least, on the non-aggression principle. And if I recall in the book, I think you kind of argue that praxeology is a better sense. Am I mistaken about that?
Yeah, I think that's basically right. So my main argument is that the non-aggression principle should be defined using praxeology, because historically in the 20th century, when libertarianism was kind of taking off, people tried to define it using physical terms, like I own this thing, or I own the property that's surrounded by this fence. And people were pretty focused on physical boundaries and boundary crossing, and how do you solve an ethical problem when you're trying to say, his hand hit my skin and it passed the border of my body, or got too close, so I was afraid. And for many things, you can figure it out using physics, so to speak. So like, I hit you, you hit me. But for more complicated ethical problems, you really need to understand what people are thinking when they're acting. So for example, you can commit a crime without ever hitting anybody or crossing any boundaries, right? You could just say something to somebody that confuses them or tricks them into doing something else to somebody, a third person. And even though I never crossed any boundaries or violated any physical dimensions, I've done something that has then led to a conflict or a crime. So like fraud is an example, right? You don't have to hit anybody to commit fraud, but you can still do something that's unethical.
And I think the significance is that praxeology takes into account actions and motives. And so that helps us to kind of determine whether the NAP, the non-aggression principle, has been violated or not, based on what action was performed and what the motive behind it was. Is that kind of a fair assessment?
Exactly. And you need to know what's going on in people's heads, both if they're the purported aggressor, like the criminal, or the victim. Because you might think that there's a crime, but if the victim, so-called victim, thinks it's okay, then maybe it's not a crime, right? Maybe two people, maybe you see somebody hit somebody, but maybe they're just boxing or something. They're playing a sport, and hitting is kind of okay if it's a consensual activity. So, and then there are other cases where you see something where the victim's not happy, but maybe it was an accident. Maybe the perpetrator was not intending to hit somebody, but they tripped, or maybe the wind blew them into something. So you really have to really know what's going on in people's heads to fully understand the ethical situation.
So the desert island or deserted island situation is one in which I think we can, these concepts seem very sort of simple and maybe easy to parse out. But a deserted island is not just different in the quantity of people, but also I think it's different in kind from a large society that's filled with lots of people. And so what kind of challenges do you think emerge when you bring these ideas into a larger society? Can those be overcome? One example that comes to mind, because I have a friend who just asked me about it, was the free rider question. That what happens to people who want to sort of don't want to pay for things but can get some benefit from society organizing in a sort of a voluntary basis. Those kinds of things.
Yeah, it's perfectly fair to ask whether anarcho-capitalism could only work in a small society. But I think the economic and historical analysis leads to the opposite conclusion. The more capitalist the society, the more it's able to function at a large scale. Central planning works fine for small groups, for example, like a family, or maybe even a small village. You can have some leader who's kind of controlling everything that's going on. But collectivism quickly leads to serious problems as population size increases. That's why you see, massive failures when it's tried on a countrywide scale with like the USSR or Venezuela or whatever. And part of this is like the information problem, where government agents just don't have enough information or ability to direct the affairs of huge numbers of people. But part of it's an incentive problem, where if you design a social system assuming that millions of people are going to act solely for the benefit of society, you're in for some rather unpleasant surprises about human nature. So yeah, I think from everything I've seen, anarcho-capitalism is very scalable. Will it scale to hundreds of billions of people? I don't know, but I think it would probably work very well at a country level and maybe even the whole world.
Good. You mentioned the information problem, and some of these are terms that if you're interested in these subjects, you kind of already know immediately. And you gave kind of a short definition, but one economist who talked about this a lot was Friedrich Hayek, who he sort of saw it as, I think, probably the central problem with this idea that we should have really smart people organizing the economy and society. But I was recently reading the Michael Malice edited Anarchist Handbook, and it's a great book, and he includes a lot of anarcho-communists, including, and I'm probably going to pronounce his name wrong, but Mikhail Bakunin, who was an opponent of Marx because he believed ultimately in the end goal, but he was like, you can't get there with the state. Excuse me. And so I think one of the points that he makes was the state being this minority, even if it were 1,000 times elected by universal suffrage and controlled in its acts by popular institutions, unless it were endowed with the omniscience, omnipresence, and the omnipotence which the theologians attribute to God, it is impossible that it could know and foresee the needs or satisfy with an even justice the most legitimate and pressing interest in the world. There will always be discontented people because there will always be some who are sacrificed. And so in my notes, I wrote a communist preceding Hayek. But it was just so funny how some of these folks who are arguing with Marx, who were really on his side in a way, said you don't get it. It doesn't work. You can't have a state that can know all the things that are necessary to know for an economy to function smoothly. And that is the kind of surprising thing about a free market economy, as as Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand. That when you sort of have all these people sort of freely pursuing their own ends, they produce things that other people want. They respond to those kind of minute changes that sort of happen on the ground level. Okay, I'm selling more apples. I need to get more apples, you know. And but to have the state manage all those things is always leads to failure. There was a stat, and I wish I could remember exactly what it was, but it had to do with the fact that the majority of produce that was consumed in the Soviet Union was produced on the small parts of private patches of land that the government allowed farmers to own. And so, yeah, that knowledge problem or the information problem is a huge issue. And so I think that's one thing that stands out to me that I think a lot of people miss. When you talk about capitalism, people think about greed. And in one sense, you know, we are talking about self-interest, that the guy who makes the apples is trying to make money, so he wants to sell a lot of apples. But, sorry, excuse me, there are people who want to buy apples, and they benefit from having them. And so that's not necessarily greed, even though you have two people acting in their own self-interest, the guy who wants the apples, the guy who wants to sell the apples. And so, as you kind of discussed earlier, it's not so much about creating a system to get the government out of the way so that we can all be greedy. It's about trying to create the system that's going to have the most amount of freedom, the most amount of prosperity, the least amount of kids starving in the streets. And whether you like it or not, trying to completely take over the economy and the lives of people to make sure that everything is fair and equitable isn't the way to do it. It doesn't work. And so it's one of those things that you almost have to, let go and let God, or let the invisible hand of the market, and that so surprisingly works better than trying to micromanage everything.
Definitely. Yeah, it's very counterintuitive, and that's one of the things I like so much about economics, is you can really start to understand the way things work, at a societal level, when people are cooperating and good things are happening that we just don't understand it with our limited human perspective. And I was also surprised, like you were, about when I was reading through the Anarchist Handbook, about how close some of the anarcho-communists came to libertarian ideas. And they were all talking about liberty and how people working together is great. And they all just had like one or two little mistakes that they made that led them astray. But yeah, there were definitely some great thinkers who were very close back then.
Yeah, I think another point that was sort of similarly surprising from some of the anarcho-communists that stuck with me was that they were sort of saying, well, of course the market works poorly now. It's because the government interferes with it. If you get the government out of the way, then the market would work more equitably. That's true. Maybe not as equitably as they'd like it to, because they're still going to be rich people. Right. But ultimately that's still a correct assessment. At least in my opinion. You've written a little on your website about the process of creating and marketing this book, and I thought that was really fascinating that you provided that data. And it really seems like you've been successful not just at writing an excellent book with great content, but in getting it out there. And that is, I think, the toughest part for a lot of artists and authors in this day and age, because you don't just have to be somebody who can write a good book. You have to be somebody who knows how to market it. And so for someone like me and friends of mine who I know have struggled to sort of find that audience, I'm curious, how did you bridge that gap?
Yeah, Michael Malice actually told me that being a successful author is mostly about marketing. In my case, that meant interviews on some relatively popular libertarian podcasts. But if you have a lot of money, you can just spend it on ads or airtime or buying tweets from influencers, things like that. If you're on a budget, though, you kind of just need to network your way to those people or platforms, or borrow somebody's platform if you can. So find somebody with a big audience, or find someone who knows them that can get you an introduction. A single mention from one of the stars of the movement can make or break a book's profitability. But I think for people who are planning to become full-time authors, you really need to build your own platform. So you need to build a following on various social media outlets and maybe even your own email distribution list. And so you might end up spending just as much time online socializing and building a following as you do writing and editing your book.
Yeah, I think that's tough for a lot of people, though. It's very, it's very different skill sets, right?
It is, yeah.
And building a base of supporters is very different than writing a book. Yeah. Well, I'm also curious about kind of next steps. Is this something that was just like something you wanted to check off your box? Sometimes I'll think about things that I'd like to do in my life, and I thought, it'd be cool to do this once or this, you know what I mean? Or do you have like future plans? And one thing that occurred to me is, as I read this book, for the most part, like up until a certain point, I was seriously considering giving it to my 9-year-old daughter, who loves like the Tuttle twins and some of these other interesting.
Yeah.
She's reading we're listening to an audiobook right now on repeat that's about like the horrors of the Soviet Union, but for a child. And
kid-friendly Gulag Archipelago.
Kind of. It's called Breaking Stalin's Nose, and it's about a kid who accidentally breaks the nose off of a Stalin statue the day after his father, who is like an interrogator for the government, gets arrested. And so it's basically his like sort of coming to terms, is kind of waking up to the reality of what the Soviet Union was, which in opposition to what he'd been told. Anyway, she loves the book. She can't stop listening. And also really likes the Tuttle twins. But there were some things in the book that was like, I thought, man, this is so close. I can almost give this to my 9-year-old, but there's a few little things that are just a little adult. And that was one thing that I'd wondered is if, moving forward, that'd be something you'd consider doing, is simplifying a book that's already very simple, that I literally thought of giving it to my 9-year-old to maybe make it a little more even kid-friendly.
Yeah, actually, I've not thought about it, but I would love to see something like that. So if anyone listening is interested in making a kids version or something like that, I'd be happy to work with them.
All right. Well, so that aside, though, are there any other thoughts that you've had about other projects in this vein, doing some more writing? Because like I said, this was really good. And I don't just mean like really good, like, the idea is really good, but it was just very, very easy to read, listen to, very persuasive. I really got the ideas. And so I'd be interested in seeing more from you.
Thanks. Yeah, I would love to. But as you probably know, writing is a big time sink, so you've got to really find a way to fit it in your schedule. Writing this one took 4 years, so I admit I have not found something that I've been like, okay, I got to sit down and write for 4 years and get this off my chest. But it could happen. Certainly could. I've got a few ideas.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I would love to see if what else comes out. I'll step aside. I'm trying to remember on your website. Do you have a mailing list?
No, but people can contact me there if they have any questions or comments. Yeah.
I was going to say I'd like to be able to be in the know when something comes out. Well, I don't want to keep you too much longer. We can talk as much as you want to, but I'm kind of working through making sure that at least the basic questions that I wanted to get answered. And the last one that I had on here that I at least want to make sure we cover would be, would America be a better society if we embraced anarcho-capitalism? And secondly, because that might be an easy question, but the more difficult question is, what are the steps to getting there from here?
Okay. Yeah, I think they're both maybe hard questions. Would it be better? Again, it's a matter of opinion. America would be wealthier. There'd be less conflict, but there might be some things that people don't like about anarchist America. There would be even more wealth disparity, not because there's poverty, but because as the poor get twice as rich, the rich get 3 times as rich or something like that. Seems like a win-win to me, but not everyone would agree. Also, if you like the idea of dropping bombs on foreigners, you're probably going to be disappointed by anarchist America. The non-aggression would apply to everyone, even if they live somewhere else, speak a different language, etc. And again, an ANCAP society would probably seem worse to government agents. They'd have to go find real jobs. But how would we get there if we think it's good, or many of us think it's good? I think part of it's what Michael Huemer advocates. You build private alternatives to government, and eventually the private sector takes over more and more of the government's doing. And hopefully you get to a point where it's totally irrelevant. Like, it doesn't even matter if the government has a post office because everyone's using FedEx or UPS or whatever. Part of it, though, is probably education as well. If everyone believes that government's a necessary evil, then it'll probably be perpetuated. But if people start to realize that government's an unnecessary evil, then private alternatives are going to look more attractive. And once they're ready to take over, people can start peacefully switching from the government options to the private options. So I think this is something that would probably happen at a small scale at first. At a state level, you've got things like the Free State Project in New Hampshire, where they're making a lot of changes to their own local laws and how things work there. At a city level, you've got examples like Sandy Springs, Georgia, where the city privatized almost every service that it renders. And this kind of experimentation will likely lead to good results for the local areas. So, I think in the case of Sandy Springs, the town was saving maybe $10 million every year. So it's lower taxes, which is going to be more attractive to people. And eventually people and companies will migrate to these areas. So they're going to move towards capitalism, and that will induce competition with other areas that either forces them to be more capitalistic, or they're just going to kind of wither as people move. And actually now, with more and more people able to work remotely, we've already seen this happening. People moving to places with lower taxes, fewer regulations, and I'm pretty hopeful that this trend is going to continue. And eventually we'll even have a few anarcho-capitalist territories to live in. Maybe not anytime soon, but hopefully in my lifetime. Just imagine living on land that you actually own instead of paying rent in the form of property taxes every year, or getting to keep the money you earn from your job instead of being a part-time slave of the IRS. I think people will find that, if not philosophically appealing, it'll appeal to their financial self-interest, and we'll start to see more and more progress over time.
So when you talk about building alternatives, a word that comes to my mind is, and I always pronounce it agorism, but I've heard other people pronounce it differently. But this idea that you sort of look for ways to kind of disconnect a little bit from, from the system as it is, including starving the beast by figuring out ways to, I don't want to say avoid paying taxes, because that sounds like tax avoidance. But it's more about not using that sort of system, right? And this kind of, I think, really hit home for me. It's something I've been thinking about, but it really hit home for me today, as there was all this news about the Prime Minister of Canada, Trudeau, who has struggled to know how to deal with this trucker situation, which is, I have the same issue with them that I had with the BLM protests, which is, I'm sympathetic with your aim, but you can't interfere with the lives of civilians, because you're not going to get them on your side. But the aim is a good one, and basically the way that the Canadian government's decided to respond to it is to declare an emergency and say we demand that any banks that are in any way helping these people or giving them money, or the private banks of individuals who are participating in these protests, go ahead and shut them out, and we'll back you up. And then if we send a tow truck company to pick up a truck and the tow truck company refuses to do it, you're also going to be arrested. And so we see how these kind of systems of doing things, particularly the banking system, can be so easily manipulated and co-opted by government. And it kind of makes you think, like, maybe I want to not be as connected to this. I mean, do you feel like that's part of the solution? I mean, agorism is a little different, because it seems it's almost like a Little House in the Prairie kind of like return to, homesteading type thing is usually what it's connected with. Whereas I think what we're talking about is trying to figure out how as a society we move in that direction. But is there any benefit to people kind of just checking out a little bit, and then those people starting to connect more with each other outside of the system?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the goal of agorism, as far as I know, is you want to disconnect from the government without disconnecting from society. So are there alternative ways to transfer wealth and money where people can make these transactions and support people that they care about without exposing themselves to the force of government, where the government's just going to come in and ruin things. So I don't think, I mean, I'm sure some agorists want to be totally off the grid and independent of society because they don't want any chance the government will interfere. But from what I've seen, the majority of agorists want to find solutions that keep us moving forward. So life gets better and better technology, and just give people better options to live their lives the way they're living them now. So that could be money and banking, but it could be communication or any other area of their lives.
You had, I don't want to keep going because I feel like we kind of keep wrapping up, and then you'll say something I think is interesting, and I'll have a note or something. But a little bit earlier, you talked about how we become kind of obsessed with wealth disparity and how we're really concerned about that as an indicator. And I've wondered why that is such a concern as well. I mean, why would we be concerned about the fact that the rich are getting richer if the poor aren't getting poorer? I mean, if overall we can look at it and say, well, the poor are in a better situation. Look at all these things these advances we made, but we're gonna have to deal with the fact that there's some rich people getting a little bit richer. I mean, is that an ethical concern or is that envy? Like, what? I don't really care if somebody richer than me gets richer as long as I'm not getting poor. Like, I don't care. Yeah. So, I mean, what do you think motivates that?
Yeah, I think you're a little bit more logical than the typical person. I'm not a psychologist, but I do think it's a lot of emotion, driven reactions to things. And people just don't understand or realize where we're coming from. I think of stories, I've heard stories about my grandparents who were immigrants to America, and for Christmas, my grandmother said she got an orange. That was her Christmas gift, right? And she would peel the skin off the orange into shapes of dolls or animals, and then play with the peel, and that was her toys for the next couple of months.
It was like a Kinder egg. It had the toy and the food combined.
Yeah, exactly. For the extremely poor immigrants in America. And nowadays, people are like, well, you're poor if you only have one car, right? And instead of 2 cars or 3 cars or whatever. So I think many people don't have perspective, and many people also let themselves be taken up by these kind of more base emotions, these less thoughtful reactions.
Yeah, I'd found I think a tweet or a Facebook post I read a few years ago, which I think sounds crude and simplistic, but I was saying, do you know how advanced we are as a society? Our poor have an obesity problem.
Right. Yeah. That's a very good point.
Okay, so I really appreciate you being here. I kind of want to say that this podcast that I do is mostly theological. So I'm a Christian theologian, but I'm interested in the subject. I've written about it a little bit, and it really, I think, connects in a lot of ways with biblical theology. That if people who listen or buy my books or whatever, have some idea about how that works. But I do want to say that I don't see the moving toward a more libertarian society as a cure-all or anything like that. I still have this, kind of broad framework where I see, the return of Christ as the most important thing that's going to change the world. But I still think, do we not want to build a society that's more free, that's more prosperous, where people are in a better position than they were before? And I think that should be obvious. If that's something that we can do, I think that's we should be motivated to move in that direction. So I appreciate the fact that you have done all this work, really, 4 years of work, at the very least, to get this information out here and to argue persuasively, because I think it's something that people of really a lot of different perspectives could benefit from, regardless of whether they're religious or secular or what kind of religious views they have. So I thank you for that, and I appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you. It's been fun chatting.
And real quick, as far as people finding you online or finding the book, you do have a website, KrisBorer.com, right? KrisBorer. And then where else can people find out about you?
That's about it. I'm not super big into social media, but
okay.
Feel free to contact me on my website. I'm happy to chat via email or something.
I did see that you have a Goodreads account, which I do as well, and I'll go ahead and follow you on that. And it looked like it was pointing to Twitter, but I don't know if you're an active user or not.
I think I've made one tweet in my life. Hopefully it's a good one if people want to check it out.
Yeah, it looks like it was from 2018. Yeah, that's really it. It's a video, but I can't quite tell.
I was giving a talk on artificial intelligence at the Twitter headquarters, and I felt like if I'm at Twitter's headquarters, I should probably make a tweet while I'm here. So I did a little.
It's interesting that that you're interested in artificial intelligence and now you're writing about politics. So anyway, anyway, it was a dumb joke about the artificial intelligence of politicians. Okay, so thank you again for your time. People really need to check out the book, The Ethics of Anarcho-Capitalism, either the book or the audio book. Get a hold of it, and that's about it.
It's been great speaking with you. Thanks.